I think so.
Maggie said that she is, and I think Mr. Kennedy is.
Wonderful. So we can call this meeting to order at 12:15.
Good afternoon. So this is the first of three planned budget workshops for the fiscal year 22 budget. Go to the next slide, please. For the purpose of the meeting this afternoon, or the workshop this afternoon, since we have so many new school board members, this is going to be an overview, a financial overview, so you can have a better sense of how revenues come in, and then what some of the responsibilities are from a governance standpoint, from a financial perspective. The second workshop will be a prelude to the first reading of the budget, which takes place the second board meeting in May. In that second workshop, I will give an overview of the proposed budget for fiscal year 22. And then each chief officer will present to the board their proposed expenditures for next year, especially as they relate to the new board goals and priorities. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to ask if it's possible for the May and June workshop, could they be at like a different day than the meeting where we're going to talk about that budget, like maybe the week before? Or is it necessary to do it all on the same day like today?
So I'll discuss that tomorrow at the cabinet meeting. Okay.
Yes, potentially have a workshop and then we put those on it. We can talk about that.
Thank you.
I apologize, but is there something that I should say to right now?
I'm sorry?
You all were looking at, I didn't know if I should add something.
No, ma'am. I was just looking at confirming with Dr. Postwaite that we will discuss this at the cabinet tomorrow morning.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, the time it.
And I think it's just a matter of the time constraints with the contract coming back from employees. It's hard to find the time to get everything ready a week sooner. It's crunch time.
Okay.
If we can get it ready sooner, we would love to present sooner.
So again, at the second workshop next month, then you will see the proposed expenditures for next year. We will take your input. We will, at that time, also have additional information coming in from the state in terms of their revenues. And then for June, we'll come back to the board with an update as to what was presented in May and discussed in May for an adoption of the fiscal year 22 budget at the end of June. So that's an overview of what's going to happen over the next 2.5 months in terms of workshops. The next slide here, I'm sorry, could you go back one, please? This is what I will cover this afternoon. Look at the workflow process and how we get started with the budget and when do we end. Take a look at the district's financial position that's guided by the fund balance. Take a look at general fund revenues, especially how the local revenues are generated. This is where the board has control. The board has no control over state funding appropriations, but you have significant control over the local revenue, how it's derived. And then we take a look at a bit about general fund expenditures, just a really big picture, a look, as opposed to details, which will come next month. And then I'll reiterate at the end of the slide that I just showed a minute ago in the future workshops. Okay. So the big picture on the process flow. So it says that we start with enrollment projections for the budget process. In fact, that is the first major milestone, although there's a ton of work that takes prep work by both the HR staff and finance staff to get us to the enrollment projections. And so the enrollment projections are done by the planning and real estate department under Mr. Barori's shop. I'm not sure whether That's Angela Barnett. I'm not sure whether she's presented that process to you all. She's done it to the Audit and Finance Committee. If we need to bring that type of view to you all, we can do that. But it's a pretty complex process. She looks at different inputs and gives various projections. So she's looking at both the total enrollment for the district, and then looking at enrollment by school, and then enrollment by grade, and by different student categories. So it's a lot of information that's the starting point for determining how many teachers would be allocated to each school, how much non-salary dollars to be allocated to each school. If you take a look at Charleston County over the last, I would say, 5 years, there has not been a significant increase in student enrollment. In fact, last year there was a decrease, but that's consistent with most districts probably across the country because of the pandemic. But prior to that, there was not significant changes in the enrollment projections. And when you take a look, if you were to take a look at Angela Barnett's projections, and she compares Charleston's change in enrollment projections over the next 5 years, let's say, to Berkeley County. And for Charleston, the increased slope is it's a narrow slope. It's not a steep slope. You take a look at Berkeley County, the slope of the increase in enrollment is fairly steep, which is an indicator of the different values of real estate between Berkeley County, Dorchester County, and Charleston County, where the real estate cost here in Charleston County is significantly higher. And so although there's in the region, there's a lot of growth, a lot of the young families, young adults with children that are school age, a lot of them are elected to go to where real estate costs are more affordable, Berkeley County and Dorchester. So in fact, I saw one of her presentations a year ago where she's predicting that in X number of years, can't remember what that X is that Berkeley County, if the growth patterns remain as they were last year, then the year before last, then Berkeley County at some point will exceed Charleston County in enrollment, so they would be larger than us. That may be, somewhere 5, 7, 8 years out. I don't remember how many years, but it's not like not decades out. So now later on in the presentation, I'll have a couple slides in here that talks about the enrollment and how those enrollment numbers are used to compute teacher points, the number of teachers that get allocated to a school, as well as the non-salary. So that's later in the presentation. Although this is the budget is a financial department responsibility, there's a lot that happens with the HR department also. So this CRF development is called Contract Recommendation Form. And so that's the starting point for schools and the finance department to engage with the HR department, make sure that we have the appropriate recruiting efforts for the number of staff that's going to be needed. And then so once those collaborations take place, there's a staff allocation. So that takes place late winter, early spring, actually late winter, where we send out to the schools what their enrollment projections are, as well as their staff allocation. So they have, as a part of their budget development, both their enrollments and their the number of staff. Well, I say the number of staff, not just the number, but very specifically how many second grade teachers, how many fifth grade teachers, how many special education teachers, et cetera. And then when the schools that's the beginning point for them to develop their individual school budgets. They send that back to the central office to finance, and then finance again coordinates with the HR department to make sure that we have the appropriate processes in place for the teacher contract issuance. So that's like that's what everybody sees that's involved in here. The schools see this, the HR folks see it, my folks obviously see it. But There's a lot that takes place behind the scene that people do not see. I mean, it's a complex system, both in terms of the technology systems we have and the complexities of the number of students and the categories of students. So it's a lot that takes place. And this budget reconciliation. So this is during the part of it's probably the only part of the entire budgeting process where I lose a lot of sleep because we have sent out information to schools saying this is what your budget is going to be. And so we have information out to schools. We have information in a system here that has not been completely reconciled with what's been sent out. And so there's this huge reconciliation process that my staff goes through to make sure that what we've been presenting to the school board, presenting to the cabinet, and talking to principals and presenting to principals reconciles to what the actual what the actual revenues are going to be, what the actual expenditures are going to be. So that's we in the last a couple of years or so, we spent a good bit of time working to improve the processes so that essentially so I can sleep better, but also to make sure that we don't have any inaccuracies as we go forward with the first reading of the budget and then the second reading of the budget. So by the time we get to the first reading of the budget, a tremendous amount of work has taken place, and this is really the first time that the board really begins to understand what the expenditures are going to be for the upcoming fiscal year, what the revenues are going to be, what the limitations might be on those revenues. We'll talk about some of that in a little bit, at least on the revenue side, the limitations here in a bit. So that's the first time doing the first reading. Then between the first reading and the second reading, the staff, both HR and finance, is doing a lot more work to prepare for the second reading of the budget, to make sure that everything's appropriate, make sure that we've incorporated feedback from the school board from the first reading of the budget. And of course, we're working this with the audit, through the audit and finance committee also. And then by the time we come to the second reading of the budget, in this case, it'll be in June. In some years past, we've done the first reading in April and the second reading in May. But so in June of this year, then we are required by state statute to be able to have a balanced budget. Last year at this time for the fiscal year 21 budget, the districts were not required to, school boards were not required to adopt the budget because of the pandemic and the uncertainty. I don't know how many school districts in the state how many boards actually adopted the budget. We did. There's probably a limited number that did, but we did. We did a lot of, the staff did a lot of financial analysis and then estimating to get to a point where we could present a budget to the board with all the uncertainty that we had. And our projections were fairly good. At the Audit and Finance Committee last week, I presented to the Audit and Finance Committee that we anticipate ending the year $24 million revenues over expenditures this year. So you'll see it. So we'll add more to the fund balance. Then we'll draw down the fund balance a lot less than what we anticipated by factor of a couple $20 million or more. And then so the board approves the budget and approves the budget. And then throughout the year, there's these monthly financial reports that I bring to the Audit and Finance Committee and then submit to the board. And I don't generally bring a monthly financial report until probably November timeframe, because the majority of our staff, at least half, was teachers, so teachers don't come on board until August sometime. So July, August, September, the level of our expenditures, that level is really low, so it's not a lot to report. And so after the first quarter, then I bring to the Audit and Finance Committee the first monthly budget report. And that's just the first three up until December is simply taking a look at comparing our revenues and expenditures in the current fiscal year to the prior fiscal year, just to make sure we don't have any anomalies. So it's a fairly high-level analysis. There's not a lot of depth to it. But once we get to the halfway point in the year, then there's a major shift in what I bring to the Audit and Finance Committee monthly in the monthly financial report. We began then to actually do a significant amount of detailed analysis, looking at revenue, predicting the revenues that are coming in. We work very closely with the county auditor's office, trying to understand assessed property values, how those assessments are changing, the values are changing rather, making sure that we understand what the revenues are going to look like. And then we also do a lot of detailed analysis on expenditures, especially on the salaries and the benefits. And so I think it's probably in February when I bring to the Audit and Finance Committee the report for December. So that's the first time that the Audit and Finance Committee gets an opportunity to see where staff thinks we're going to end the year. And then as we move deeper into the year, into the spring, then the analysis remains the same. The way that we analyze remains the same, but it becomes more refined. So by the time we get to May timeframe, when I present in a couple of weeks to the Audit and Finance Committee, my level of confidence on where we're going to end the year is extremely high. And so in the last 3 years going through that process, we have always exceeded the predictions that we've had, the estimates that we've had, so that where revenues have been higher than over expenditures than what they were initially in the first presentation, which reflects a conservative approach to financial analysis and financial data presentation. The finance department's work really accelerates in the summertime because we close the books. So it's a complex system, a lot of transactions. So we have to spend a lot of time in the summer closing the books for the year, getting prepared for our external auditors because they'll be in here in late summer, early fall. And then there's a set of financial statements required by statute again to be prepared, and we have until I think it's either November 30 or December 1st each year that we are required to submit a full set of financial statements to the state. That the financial statements being primarily the balance sheet and the revenues and expenditures. So that's the overview of the cycle. What questions do you have on that?
We can go around. Ms. Darby? Dr. Frazier? Dr. French?
Yeah, I had a question about the enrollment projections. So I understand what you're saying, that we're expecting slower growth within Charleston County than other districts. However, I think we've been hearing from some constituent boards that they're concerned about enrollment numbers in their area. Are there differences in how people are moving around within the district that might impact our decisions?
So those inter-district movements, they are taken into account by Angela Barnett, the person that does the analysis. So over at Johns Island, as an example, or if there are housing areas, which there are, and there are more children coming in, then her analysis or estimates reflect that. That type of movement. Yes.
Ms. Green? Ms. Green, did you have any questions? Maybe no. Okay, we'll come back if so. Ms. Herderick?
No questions.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any questions.
Okay, Maggie, next slide. Thank you. So this next series of slides, 4 or 5, maybe 6 slides, it's called district, I'm labeling it the district's financial position. And it relates to the district's fund balance, which is a part of the district's financial statement, specifically the balance sheet. And when I look at a system like this in terms of, and the reason I'm covering this today is because of, again, so many new board members. When I think about the responsibility of the board from a financial standpoint, looking at it from a board governance standpoint, the fund balance is something that needs to be paid attention to. So you take a look at the graph here on the left. In fiscal year 14, the district had, looks like $57 million of fund balance. Now I'm gonna get into a little bit more details about what fund balance is. And then it dropped in fiscal year 15, and it continued to drop in fiscal year 16. In FY17, my predecessor began to turn that around, and you see in 17, we regained some of the fund balance. And then in 18, it went up again. 19, it went up again. 20, currently, if you were to look at the district's financial statements, you would see a fund balance of $145.2 million. So that's currently on the balance sheet. In developing the budget for fiscal year 21, the current budget, one of the ways we were able to move forward with the budget in the face of the pandemic was that we planned on using roughly $33 million of that $145 million to balance the budget. So if you were to take a look at the budgeted fund balance for fiscal year 21, that number is $112 million. But in fact, we will, as I indicated a few minutes ago, in which I briefed the Audit and Finance Committee last Tuesday in the financial report, we will add, in the neighborhood of $24 million to the fund balance. So when we close the books this summer and issue financial statements this fall, then the last column there to the right says 135.6 million. So we right now are projecting that we will end the year with a fund balance of $135.6 million versus the 112 that we had planned for. So I'm talking a little bit about a fund balance and what it is. It's, so it's simply a reserve. A number of years ago, the governing body for this type of work, and I'll talk about that in a second, changed the terminology from reserves to a fund balance. So it's simply just a reserve that's set aside for various purposes. The GFOA, which is listed in the second bullet at the bottom there, that's the Government Finance Officers Association. Sorry, I didn't spell that out. So the GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association. So that is a body that is an association that represents people like me, CFOs, budget directors, finance people that are in that work for governmental entities, school districts, cities, city governments, county governments, et cetera. So the GFOA makes a lot of recommendations, and those are just that, recommendations. They are not requirements, they are recommendations. And their recommendations are based on best practices across the country. And so I pay a lot of attention to their their recommendations. They recommend, the GFOA recommends that at a minimum, that governmental entities should maintain 2 months of expenditures as reserve, at a minimum 2 months ago. So that's roughly a little over 16%. And I'll talk about our numbers in a bit. Currently, there's a state statute that requires school districts to maintain at least 1 month. So it's 8 points something percent. So the state requirement is is 1 month. The GFOA recommendation is 2 months. In 2020, this last year, this time, the school board, before the new board members came on, revised this fund balance policy. And by the way, the fund balance policy is policy DFAC. So you can see that fund balance. And this table, which I'll go through in a second, is from that policy. The last bullet at the bottom here talks about the reasons to maintain a healthy fund balance. They include providing cash flow support for cyclical tax collections. So for instance, I think 3 years, so every fall, late fall, we have to sell bonds for cash flow purposes. So we have tax collections that don't get started until late in the fall, but we have cash requirements much earlier, like late summer, early fall, before taxes are collected. And so we go to the bond market every fall to issue a what's called a TAN, tax anticipation note. I think 3 years ago that note was, I believe, was about in the mid 60s, around $65 million or so. This past fall, that had dropped to under $30 million. We were able to, and so that means if you're borrowing less money, it costs less. There's less cost to the district. Of course, you're not paying interest on this much money, and so we were able to do that because our fund balance is it's in such a healthy position. So we were able to sustain our operations without having to borrow as much money. Potential for better interest rates. Just last Wednesday, I think it was. So tomorrow, Moody's, which is one of the bond rating agencies, they have to rate a district's credit worthiness every time we get ready to issue bonds. So we will issue, close to $230 million worth of bonds very soon, in a couple of weeks. It's the regular bond anticipation notes in terms of the tax collection on sales tax and paying down debt. And so they will issue their ratings tomorrow. Last Wednesday, we spent about an hour on the phone with Moody's, so they go through a process of interrogating me and others in the district about what the financial position is of the district. So we did that last Wednesday, and then they will do they are doing their analysis, and then tomorrow they will issue a press release saying what the bond ratings are going to be. Now, I will anticipate that our bond ratings will remain positive. I'm always hopeful that in the spring that they will go up. They went up once since I've been here. I don't know whether the rating will go up or not, but certainly I expect it to remain positive. And one of the things that the rating agencies really focus on is the fund balance of a district, and they compare. And you can see it in their reports. They will look at our fund balance. They will compare that to the national average of organizations or school districts our size, and say that we are either below that average, and if so, are we on a trajectory to move closer to the average? And if so, that's positive. If we are below the average and don't have a trajectory to get to the average or above, then that becomes a negative in their analysis. So that will be issued sometime tomorrow. So I think maybe 3 years ago, we revamped the fund balance policy, and last year there was a second revision to that in the last 3 years or so. Here in this table, it talks about the fund balance categories. I'll go through each one briefly in a second here. The non-spendable, spendable, the restricted, committed, assigned, unassigned. Those are different categories in the fund balance policy. So I mentioned a few minutes ago the GFOA is an association that recommends best practices. There's another organization called GASB, GASB, that's the Government Accounting Standards Board. So the GFOA recommends, the GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, does not recommend. They say thou shalt do X. And so when the GASB issues what they call a pronouncement, and then governmental accounting groups have to comply. It's just like there's another group called the FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board, that private concerns like Boeing, as an example, would have to comply with. And so the reason for this compliance issue and the issuance of all of these pronouncements, the GASB that's associated with the fund balances, GASB 54, is very prescriptive. That's because, let's say, for instance, with the bond rating agency. So the bond rating agencies are looking at school districts across the country and their financial conditions. And so the set of financial statements that CCSD puts out, it has to be the same structure, the same format as any other school district in the country. If those structures and the way those the accounting works is different, if that's different across entities, then there's not reliability in being able to compare from one district to the next. So the GASB is a requirement, it's authority from the U.S. federal government, and so we are required to comply. And so they have these categories here: non-spendable fund balance, something that we don't really get into a lot. It's inventories that we may have of prepaid items, like if we prepay for insurance, as an example. So that becomes an asset on the books. And so we put that into the non-spendable fund balance until it's paid off, paid down. Restricted, so we don't have, so these numbers that you see up to the right, these are the actual amounts that are on our balance sheet right now. So we don't have anything in restricted, but that's typically if you have some outstanding debt not associated with the bonds, but some other type of debt that you have to, from a statutory standpoint, that you have to pay off. Committed. So this is the big change that took place 3 years ago, and another big change that took place last year with the fund balance. So if you recall, I said that the state requirements by statutes that you have 1 month of reserves, fund balance. The GFOA best practice is 2 months. That $41.9 million represents 1 month for the school district. And so 3 years ago, the school board made a change to the fund balance and said that we are going to hold in the committed category 1 month of reserves for emergencies. And the only way it can be used is for that, only reason it can be used is for that purpose. So in order to not use it for that purpose, the board has to take a positive vote and say we're no longer going to use these dollars for a reserve. Last year, when the budget was being developed, the fund balance policy was changed, maybe it was in the summer, but sometime last calendar year, to say that we are going to, that the district is going to go with the GASB, the 16% or the average of 2 months of expenditures. And so that number then doubles from $41.9 million to essentially $84 million. Now, I said that the GASB, there are strict rules that you have to follow. So some of these rules are timing. And so what the board voted on last year was that we would take 2 months of expenditures and put into committed for emergency purposes. And so so when we close the books this year, we will move 16% or 2 months into the committed. So it'll be when you see the financial statements this fall, you will see $80-something million in that. And again, that is only for emergency. And I say the timing, the board has to make the decision at a certain point, and then in the timing is associated when you close the books or when the fiscal year closes. So we missed that window, but it's in the notes in the financial statement saying that that the board has made this decision. And so when we close the books, our external auditors, when they're compiling our financial statements, they will put that amount in. And so, one might think that that is a significant amount of money. I mean, it is a significant amount, but the question is it the right thing to do? So since I've been associated with Charleston County School District, there have been three financial crises. One was in the end of the first Capitol building program. It took place around 2003, 2004. And we were not in a position to rapidly recover from that in terms of our fund balance. The second one was at the Great Recession in 2008. When you take a look at all what happened in 2000 as a reaction to that here in the district, we ended up having to furlough people, cut back tremendously on expenses. I can't remember where people were laid off now, but certainly we had furloughs across the board. And so it was very difficult to get through that. And then the last one was in 2015 when we didn't have enough reserves to handle that crisis. And so it took about 3 years to recover from that. So this amount that's in the committed is to protect us from those types of things. It's to protect us from something like the pandemic. And so, you take a look at this past year, we had the pandemic. We knew that there was going to be significant problems, potential revenue problems. And also, we got lucky because we had no hurricane. But we had a major hurricane last year on top of the pandemic, the pressure on our financials would have been tremendous, and the district would have been protected because of the board's adoption of this fund balance policy. The assigned fund balance, those are for specific reasons, purposes, other than committed. So for instance, that's a big number again this year, probably the largest number since I've been here, 33.9 million. But a part of that was to balance the budget, as I indicated. If you take a look at the early college, high school each year for the last 3 years, as we knew that an additional year of students were going to be added to early college, high school, we funded that through, advanced funded that through fund balance. When Mr. Brigman 3 years ago worked towards getting teacher salaries up to the minimum start of $40,000 per year, we funded the out years on that through the assigned fund balance. And then everything else then that's not either committed or assigned or restricted, et cetera, it goes into just a general account called unassigned. That unassigned will go down significantly when we close the books because we're going to move another $40-something million into the to the committed. A couple more slides on the fund balance, and then and then I'll stop for questioning. So I'm going to go back just a short distance in time, and so the next 3 slides are from the district's external auditors, Green, Finney, Horton, when they issued the financial statements in 2015. Now I've gone back and I've taken a look at their report for fiscal year 15, fiscal year 14, and fiscal year 13. I'm only presenting today the fiscal year 15, but the 14 and the 13 years, those years tell the same picture I'm going to tell here that they told for fiscal year 15. And so you can see the table here, or the graph rather, to the right. It's sort of the picture I showed you a few minutes ago with the fund balance graph that I showed, that over time, the fund balance was being depleted. Then over on the left in the narrative there, they reiterate what I said, that the state requirement is, at the last bullet, is 8% of next year's general fund operating budget should be in general fund, 8% being 1 month. And then right above there, there's the GFOA recommendation of 16.7%, which is 2 months. And then at the very top, at the first bullet, it says that the district's position is only 3.9%. Not only is it nowhere close to the GFOA recommendation, it's way below half of what the state requires. Next slide. The only point I want to make on here, and again, this is from the external auditors report in 2015. It says general fund revenue, that first line, it says that for this year, this year being fiscal year 15 rather, that there was $10 million under budget for revenues. So revenues were wherever they were projected to be budgeted, rather wherever the board approved, and we came in $10 million less in revenues. Thank you. And then on the expenditure side, then for that same year, we came in almost $6 million over budget. So less revenue than budgeted, and more expenditures than budget. And so that of a pattern over several years then required the district to use reserves, fund balance, to stay afloat, to keep balancing its budget. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, go back one. But so at any rate, those were the numbers in 2015, and so that was in calendar year 2015, later in the year, the fall, I think it was, when we had the fiscal crisis, showing that we were $18.8 million short of being able to operate. And again, if the fund balance had been adequate, and from a governance standpoint, the board takes a look at how the fund balance is changing over time, then the type of fiscal challenges that we sometimes get into can be avoided. Next slide. And the last slide on the fund balance or the fiscal position, this line graph goes back to fiscal year 14 and up to FY21. FY21 is a projection. The red line shows expenditures, and the blue line shows revenue. So where there's a gap between those two lines, if the red line is above the blue line, that means we're in a negative position. And then if the blue line is above the red line, that means we're in a positive position. And so the last few years, we've been able to operate in a positive position, again, due to the Audit and Finance Committee making recommendations to the full board on how to manage this type of financial position. So with that, I'm going to stop with that section and see what questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Ms. Darby?
I don't have any questions.
I was a little confused about what the emergency was in 2015. I may just not have heard it.
Well, again, our revenues were under less than the expenditures were too high, revenues were too low, and so we had an $18.8 million budget gap.
Oh, okay. So
And that's not shown. That's not shown in the presentation.
right.
Okay, so I didn't show in the presentation. I talked about the three fiscal crises in the last 15, 16 years or so. But I didn't show any of those numbers. Just reference them.
And I don't know the things that we were over budget that year. How do we prevent not predicting this better? Because I mean, salaries don't usually change over the year. Fringe benefits don't usually change over the year. So I'm confused about that.
Do you mind if I address that really quickly, since I was here and on the board? So that was, you probably saw, there was lots of coverage in the newspaper. There were so many things that were different. The board was not getting the same kind of regular financial information. The board wasn't looking at financial statements on a monthly basis. And I'll say this, and not to put you all to say this, but my impression is that there was, something would come up and they would say, oh, we'll move money from here to pay for this, like rob Peter to pay Paul. It's my words, not anybody else's words. So I just think there wasn't a real tight look like Don has, sleepless nights of monitoring, in the very beginning, what are our actuals for salary compared to what the budget is? Okay, what is this new initiative the board wants? Okay, how are we going to pay for it? Those kinds of things weren't happening. And so we ended up being like 16 million or 18 million in the hole right when we came on the board, when Eric, that after 2014. So my answer back to that would be the internal controls are much better. The process that we have for communication, audit and finance operates better. And even interesting thing in that time is that really even the auditors did not catch that we were going to be in that kind of shape, changed auditors. So I think that right after that happened, Dr. Postwaite came on board and there was a lot of looking at how do we make sure that kind of an emergency doesn't happen again. We can't control the economy, the Great Recession, that kind of stuff, but we should have been able to prevent that from happening, so.
Yeah, and so I would say 4 things happened. One is that once the fiscal crisis took place, there was a thorough analysis to see what went wrong. And that's one. So those were identified. My predecessor, Glenn Steigman, he modified a lot. He took the report and did some real changes. One of the problems we had was how we budget. So Glenn made some significant changes there. The third thing is that I have put in some real strong financial analysis. So my staff knows how to do this. They do it not once a year, they do it at least once a month. And the fourth thing, because of those prior 3 things, that I know where we are financially throughout the year. When we had this crisis in 2015, I mean, we didn't know where we were until it sort of like jumped out on us. And so I know where we are, just like I briefed our finance committee last week, and I told you all today that where I expect to end the year in the positive. And so those numbers are pretty solid because of those things that were put in place that started with my predecessor.
Thank you. Ms. Green? Okay.
No questions.
Thank-
Thanks for the clear explanation, Dawn.
Thanks, Ms. Green. Ms. Herbie?
No question.
Thank you. I did have one question. When it comes to the restricted and the not the non-spendable, the restricted and the committed, is the only difference that the committed money has to be voted on by the board and then the restricted is more like state or federal?
So the restricted is typically is because of some statute. And so let's say state statute or federal statute. And then on the committed is completely up to the board.
Okay, thank you. And thank you. This was really thorough and I'm like, okay, light bulb, some things are coming together. So thank you very much.
All right, next slide. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Frazier.
There's something in here called a tip. Please explain to me. What is a tip?
What slide are you on?
You passed it on slide 8.
Eight.
But I want to ask that question.
You might need your microphone. The people on Zoom.
Oh,
No. So
the far lot.
So Dr. Frazier.
Yes, sir.
So that slide was from the external auditor's presentation in 2015.
Mhm.
Later in my presentation here,
Mhm.
I'm going to talk about the TIF.
All right.
Okay.
And the far lot revenues also?
The what?
Far lot revenues.
Right.
Oh, fee in lieu.
Really?
Well, I can talk a little bit about that. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So just for information right now, I'm certainly, I can respond to questions, but for information right now, I'm going to talk about how, first of all, you see a picture of all the districts' general operating fund revenue. So you see the local, state, the federal, and what we call other. for FY 21, FY 20, budgeted 21, projected for 21, and projected for next year. And the reason for this, and you'll see these revenue numbers in more deep, you'll see them again next month during the second board workshop. But just for information right now, you can see in the pie chart at the bottom of the slide, that 60%, a little over 60% of our revenues for the district and general operating fund comes from local taxes. We pick up another 35% from the state. And I'm going to talk about how both of those are generated in a minute. And then 3.5% from others. Next slide. So local revenues generated through millage. So we have assessed property values, and taxes are levied against those properties. Here in the state of South Carolina, the only properties that generate revenue for school districts operating is from what's called 6% of property, which is business property. So if you're a homeowner and you live in your house, then you pay no taxes for general operating. So you don't pay for teacher salaries, nothing for education. You do for capital, for debt.
Can you repeat that, please?
So because of Act 388, which was enacted, I think it was in 2007, 2008, maybe 2006 timeframe, that Act 388 excludes homeowner occupied property from taxes for the general operating fund of school district. So for instance, I've lived a number of places, and in every place I've lived when my children were growing up, where I owned houses, I always paid taxes, and that was just an expectation that I had as my children were growing up. But if you live here in the state of South Carolina, that is not the case. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that impact is to us here. This slide here shows the history of the millage rate going back to 2012. And so this is, the board will have to vote in June, well, actually next month, first reading and the second reading, on what the millage that you're going to set, or the district's going to set. So that millage number then becomes the basis for taxes that are collected from businesses. So any business owner who has property, then that business owner, and that includes people that own rental property. So if you own a house and you rent it out, well, you do pay taxes there. But if you live in it, you do not. And so it's important, I think, for you all to understand millage. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the millage here in a second, because that's what you're actually voting on. You're telling the county in the fall, September, October timeframe, I have to sign a document, and that the county auditor and I have to be in agreement with, and that is the basis then for the county to levy tax collections and send out tax bills. And so it's then, it's what you all vote on. There's a couple little things in here. Going on to the right of this graph, you see a dip in the millage rate in the current year, 2021. So it went down from 2020. There was a reassessment, and so I think it's every 5 years or so, there's a requirement that the county does a reassessment of property values to determine whether properties are increasing or if they're decreasing. So that takes place once every 5 years or so. And so when we have a reassessment, typically it's been always the case, but I've been associated with Charleston. In a place like Charleston County, because of the high value of property, then that reassessment always kicks up or jumps up the value of assessed properties. And so if you took the same millage rate and apply it against the higher assessed property value, then the district would end up with a windfall. And so the state prevents that because, and that's what you see here, is that there has to be what they call a rollback to be able to roll back the tax rate, the millage rate, to what it would have been had it not, that would generate the same amount of revenue had we not had the reassessment. The other time that the assessed property values go up, and they do from year to year, even outside of the reassessment, is when new properties come onto the roll, and then also if there's an exchange of properties. If I sell some property that I own to someone else, then that the higher value then doesn't wait until the reassessment. That higher value is placed on the books at that time. And so this year, fiscal year 21, the other reason why the number is lower is because, so there's something called under Act 388, allowable millage. So every school district, there's a maximum amount that school districts can raise millage each year. And each district actually, the state determines what that allowable millage rate is. And it is based on the district's population growth, the change in population, as well as, so it's a combination of the population growth and the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And typically for Charleston, over the last X number of years, that's been in the neighborhood of 3-point-something mil. So you could raise millage 3-point-something, 3.4, 3.3, whatever, as a maximum. You could not go up to 5 mils as an example. And I have some slides to talk about a little bit more about millage. And what the board did the current year was that there was not an increase in the millage. So the state said that Charleston County had 3-point-something mils that was allowable, that we could have increased taxes. We did not increase taxes. So we kept the millage flat, and that was because of the uncertainty of the financial uncertainty of the business community associated with the pandemic. So the board was able to adopt the budget, allocate resources for the acceleration schools as an example, and do so without increasing taxes. They were able to do that because of the fund balance position, the strong fiscal position of the district. And then in 22, fiscal year 22, it shows an increase. And the reason why it's showing an increase, when I come to the board next month, more than likely I'll recommend that we do increase, that we recover those that millage that we did not use last year, which we are allowed to do. Next slide. So this I don't know, this picture. When I came here in 2018, this was on the wall in my office. And if you take a look in the bottom left-hand corner, it was made in March of 2006. And actually, I had that made when I was here before, and it was still on my wall when I came back. And so I had somebody take a picture of it to explain this, my attempt back then to explain what a mill is. So the circle represents $1. The circle represents $1. And so 1/2 of $1 is 50 cents. So that's what, so half a dollar is 50 cents. 1/100 of $1 is a penny. So it takes 100 pennies to make $1. A meal is 1/1000 of $1. So it's a real small number. So it's 1/1000 of $1. But it takes a lot of, because as you'll see in a second, that means that to generate $300-something million worth of revenue, then you got to have a lot of, the assessed property value has to be really big to have these small numbers of a mill. Next slide. And this is an example of creating the millage for, not millage, but the general operating fund through millage. I will start at the bottom. So I mentioned that a mill is worth, is 1/1000 of $1. The value of a mill currently is that last number here, 2,875,000. So 1 mil equals $2,875,000. So going back up to the top here, the projected, in these projections on, so my staff, only thing they do is do some calculations here. The projections in terms of assessed property values is done by the county auditor's office. So we don't do that. We work very closely with the county auditor's office, make sure we understand what the assessed properties are, what we jointly think was the change in those values, the percentage change in those values, because we have to sign off on those. And so the assessed property values right now, a non-owner occupied real property is this top number, $2.4 million. We add something to that, projected personal property, excuse me, $400 million. The big number, the top number is $1 billion, so 2.4 billion. Then motor vehicles, another $100 million. And so you add all those three numbers up, and you have a property base of $2.9 billion. 2.9 billion. And so if you were to look back on that graph that shows the history of the millage, the last number for fiscal year 22 shows that we are projecting using 123.4 mils for next year's budget, 123.4. Then you go back to the table, and you see there's that 123.4 as the millage rate, and then we apply that against the base of property values of 2.9 billion, and that generates $359.9 million of potential revenue. The calculations are a little convoluted, so we have to bring out the motor vehicle taxes half a year, then add that back in. So that then generates $374 million. And then we have to subtract from that, Dr. Frazier, the tax increment financing, TIF, that's the TIF. So before I talk about the TIF, we subtract the TIF out of the 374, and then that takes us down to projected revenues of $354 million of local revenue. So the TIF then is the tax increment financing district. So it's a way for a governmental entity like the county government or the city government to develop property, and to do so using money from entities like school districts to help do that. And so the way it works is that properties, that there's a what they call a TIF district, some geographical location. And so if the board agrees to participate in the TIF, then as the property is developed, presumably the value is going to increase. I'll give an example in a second. So you just have vacant land that's not used for anything. So that has a value, and then you put something on it, some structure on it, some office buildings or whatever, then the value of that increases. And so you're developing some parts of the county, some parts of the city. And then as that property value increases as it's developed, it's generating more tax revenue. And so if we for anybody any entity that participates in the TIF, what you're saying you would do is that you're going to forego the revenue, the additional revenue that's generated as the property is being developed, and for X number of years. And so we have several TIFs, 5 or 6 TIFs on the books that we participate in, and we lose revenue. So that means we lose, in this particular year, $19 million of potential revenue that we had to forego because we have participated in TIF to allow for something to be developed. So the example that I like to use is that at some point in the past, I don't know when it happened, but there was a TIF that we participated in, the district participated in, for the development of the Mount Pleasant Town Center. And so that TIF expired about 2 years ago, I think it was. And but at the expiration of that TIF, the district was losing $10 million per year in revenue. Now, last year, the Audit and Finance Committee and the board decided that was, and typically in these TIFs, there's no real benefit to our kids. I mean, yes, there's economic benefit in terms of the community because, there's development, but in terms of, um, benefits to our children through it from an educational standpoint, there's none. And so last year, the board adopted created a completely new policy. It wasn't a modification. They created a TIF policy, and they laid out the parameters of when the district could participate in a TIF. And so there's some very strict requirements on that. And so if you take, I don't know the policy number, but it's the TIF policy, and it'll be in the finance section of the policy. So that's a TIF, and then I think the fee in lieu of the fee lot is similar, so that you have some corporation that comes in, there's into the community, to the county, and there's tax incentives that are given, and so that entity may pay some type of fee in lieu of paying taxes on its property value. So, for instance, there's one for Boeing. So, so Boeing is a great thing for the community, but they didn't just walk in here. They had to have some incentives to be able to locate their 787 factory here. And one of those incentives was a fee in lieu of. So instead of paying some property taxes, there's this fee that they pay us, which is less than the value of the property. So
That policy is policy DE, if anybody wants to look at. Policy DE, tax increment financing.
So that's the overview on the local taxes. What questions? I mean, like local revenue and taxes associated with it. What questions do you have?
Thank you. Reverend Mack, would you like me to continue? Okay, so we'll start on this side with Ms. Herderick.
Can you come back to me, actually?
Sure, thank you. Ms. Green?
Yeah, I just want Don to explain the first two categories where it talks about non-owner occupied real estate and personal property assessments. If you could explain that in conjunction with at Act 388, because that makes it look like we are actually benefiting from personal property taxes, which I know we aren't.
So,
do you
so
understand what I'm saying?
I do, and I'll just say what these two items are, but I do have a slide in a couple minutes that talks more about Act 388 and the impact on us locally.
Okay.
There, but then the top line here, the 2.4 billion, that's simply real property. That's land and buildings. The second one is personal property. That's somebody that owns a boat. That's an example. And then the third one is vehicles, cars, trucks, etc.
Okay. I understood it. I just wanted to make sure that, since we're going to talk about 388. Okay, thank you, Don.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Dr. French?
I just want to say thank you for explaining the millage so thoroughly. I remember when I think I was in elementary school and they were trying to pass a 1 millage increase. And I was just so outraged that nobody voted for it.
In elementary. Dr. Frazier? Okay, Ms. Darby?
Yep, I'm good. Good explanation. Now, hearing it the 7th time, I think I got it.
Reverend Mack, I know you just
Thank
walked in.
you.
I only have one question. I know that you said we're going to vote and you're going to recommend increasing the millage rate. Is there some more information we can have about the impacts of our decision? I know it's it's going to have an impact on the public. And although I totally understand the millage piece, I don't understand the adverse effects necessarily.
So I think the proposed millage increase that I'm contemplating is like 4 point something mils. So if you take that I'll give you, when you subtract the 123.4 on that graph from the FY 21, and so multiply that times the could you go back? Oh, yeah, that bottom number, the 2.875. So multiply that times the millage increase, that would tell you how much additional taxes that would be collected if that millage rate is approved. And then in some presentation that I made a couple of years ago, I think we have a slide that talks about the impact we call it on the average taxpayer. So if it goes up by 4 point, whatever that number is, that goes up by 10, 11, 12 million dollars, then how much additional would the average taxpayer pay? And so we can put that, update that slide when we come back to the second workshop next month.
Thank you. And Ms. Carteret?
Is there collaboration with the county when we recommend the increases?
That's strictly up to the school board. Okay. The collaboration that my staff and I do is simply understanding the numbers. Okay. And then once we understand the numbers, then I take up information to the cabinet, and the cabinet makes a decision, and then that decision then is recommended to y'all. But that's completely independent of anything that the county may do, other than understanding the numbers.
Okay, thank you.
You all have complete control of that. Within the limitations of Act 388, you cannot go above the allowable millage. Now, if you don't expend, if you forego millage for in a year, you don't necessarily lose it right away. So it can accrue for, I don't know the number of years, but several years. And so one of the ways, that's an example, that the district came out of the fiscal crisis, the one I mentioned in 2015, taxes were being not increasing prior to that. And so there was a big tax increase to the public because we had to have a way to generate revenue since so much revenue had been lost. And so we essentially wiped out that backlog. So right now we have all of last year's 3 point something. And I think in fiscal year 20, there was a small amount, I want to say 0.8 or something like that. But it's point something less than a mil that was left on. So we have 4 point something now that we could upgrade.
I have one follow-up question. For the TIFs, for an organization to approach the district and for us to agree with that, is it the actual, so you gave the example of the town center. Did they approach you as a business entity to forego that, or is the city of Mount Pleasant?
No, it would have been the city of Mount Pleasant. Okay. So a private developer cannot come in and to the board and ask. Now, when the governmental entity, the town of Mount Pleasant or Charleston City or the county, if they come into the board and ask for a TIF, they've already been working with developers, and they may bring in, especially when they come into the Audit Finance Committee, they bring in some developers to explain it, but okay. Developers cannot start that process.
Okay, thank you.
And Reverend Mack, I think.
Mr. Kennedy, please accept my apology. I do know you probably already explained this already, but just briefly tell me again why the proposed request for the full mill increase?
I'm sorry, say again, sir?
The full mill increase, what was the reason behind the potential proposal for that request? Is that what I heard you said earlier?
So what I said is that in all likelihood, I'm going to recommend to the cabinet, and what I said at the beginning of the presentation here is that the presentation today is more of a educational component to this budget process. It's primarily for the benefit of the new board members. And so we are not presenting today any information on what potential expenditures are next year. So we will do that at the second workshop, which would be in May. And then we will fully explain what any millage increase would cover.
Okay, all right. Because that was going to be my follow-up question, but now that better explains why. Okay, got it. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. If I don't think anybody has a question. I don't think so. Okay. I think we can keep going.
All right, so that was local revenues, now state revenues. And this pie chart shows how the state revenues are, how they come in. We get 49% roughly from property tax relief. That's associated with Act 388, foregoing the ability to raise local taxes. I'll talk more about that in detail in a minute. We get 25% from the Education Finance Act that was created a long time ago. And then another 25% from what we call restricted state revenue. So there's another state statute on education, EIA, the Education Improvement Act. And so there's a substantial amount in from there. So for this year, we will get, I don't remember the exact number, but $194 million, 190 something million dollars of state revenue versus, like the $350 or $340 million of local revenue. So again, the local revenues are higher for Charleston than the state revenue. 60% of our general fund revenues are generated locally, and 35%, I think it is.
I'm good. I just
sorry?
finished.
Miss Green, can you mute?
Oh, I'm sorry.
So let me talk about then Act 388. Again, it was enacted over a decade ago. I think it was 2006, 2007 timeframe. So on this slide, I'm talking about several things. So the EFA, the Education Finance Act, it's that act dictates how much per pupil amount every student in the state of South Carolina is to receive. Besides, you got 700 some thousand students in the state of South Carolina across, in the public school system. The base student cost then is the component of the EFA, the base student cost. The state has told us that for next school year, the base student cost will be $2,500. So every one of the 700 some thousand students is allocated $2,500. It's part of EFA funding formula. Now we don't get that much, that amount, and I'll talk about that in a second. And so there's something as a part of the EFA called the Index of Taxpaying Ability, the ITA. This is a very important factor in how much revenue we get from the state. It's ITA, Index of Taxpaying Ability. And so what that does then, the state does, well, maybe the counties do it, but report it to the state. But every county, every district, the total property values are added up for that district, reported to the state, and the state then combines that for a statewide amount. And then each county then, their proportionate, their share of that, a percentage or a factor, this index of taxpaying ability is created. So the higher your property values, higher a county's property values, the higher your tax paying ability rate is, your index of tax paying ability rate. And what that, again, this is from the EFA, the Education Finance Act, which is, took place a long time ago. And so what it says that out of that $2,500 base student cost that each student has to get, if a county is wealthy, that county by the statute has to pay a share of that $2,500. And then if you're in a poor county, like Road and Farlington, then the index for that county would be very low, and they would get close to 100% of the $2,500, whereas we only get here in Charleston roughly a third. So if you take a look at the table at the bottom, if you go down to the bottom line, it says FY22 state projections. Our tax over the next column, it says our index of tax paying ability is 0.14270. If you look right above that that 0.14270, then you will see last year, so the current year, fiscal year 21, that our index has gone up. That means our property values relative to the rest of the state has increased greater than anybody else's in the state. So our ability to pay is greater. And so with it's coming up, staying on the bottom line here of the 2,500 base student costs for next year, Charleston County students, for every one of our students, instead of getting $2,500 from the state, we will only get $812 from the state, or 32% of that $2,500. And then you can take a look at the last number, we get $49.7 million next year for our students on the EFA, compared to this year of 51 million. So the amount of money that we're getting from the state is actually going down because our index of tax payability, our property values have increased greater than the state average. And you can see this playing out if you go up to FY18 and FY19, you see where in the index of tax payability, our index actually dropped. And I don't think I've ever seen that before. And so, and you come over to how much CCSD receives column, you see between 18 and 19, we actually got more money in 19 compared to 18, because our index went down. And so that's a rarity. Our index is typically where you see it right now, where we get around 32% or so from of that 2,500. We are the richest county in the state of South Carolina as it relates to property values. And so we will never, I cannot, there's no way I can predict that far into the future to say that our property values are going to start decreasing significantly compared to other parts of the state. And so the way that plays out, the insidious way that is. Let's go to the next slide. So before I explain the slide, so the index of tax payability says that if a county can afford the cost of property values to pay a greater share, and the concept is, I think it's sound, that part of it, of educating its children, then you have the financial wherewithal through taxes to be able to do that. Whereas again, if you're from a poor county, in terms of the property values, then you can't afford to do that. And so then the state's going to take a bigger share of this for those counties. And so what the EFA and Index of Tax Payability says that Charleston County has the ability to make up the difference between that $812 that the state's giving us and the $2,500 of base student costs. So the state's saying that it costs $2,500 that we need to be allocated to students. Charleston, we're going to give you $812. You make up the other $1,700 by raising property taxes. So that was all sound until Act 388 came on board. And what Act 388 says then, by the way, you're the wealthiest county in the state, you have the ability to do that, but we're going to restrict that ability, and we cap it. We're going to cap it using the allowable millage cap that the state calculates every year, which is population growth and the combination of population growth and the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So what this line graph shows here is the red line. When the state back in 2006, 2007 adopted the Act of 388, the plan was for the state then to Act 388 stripped out owner-occupied property from general operating tax rolls. So this is the act that says that property taxes cannot be levied on homeowner property. And what the state said as part of the act was that we are going to replace that through, where is it? The property tax relief, So if you're a county, you're going to lose money, the ability to raise money because of the Act 388, then we the state, going to replace that. And this happened right, the act was adopted right before we went into the Great Recession. And so what happened after the Great Recession, instead of the base student cost going up as it should have, and that was projected, the base student, I should have brought a history of the base student cost, but the base student cost actually dropped significantly And so the state didn't have the money, the funds to be able to do what Act 388 says. And so the gap between those two lines here, the red line is what we've actually been able to recover from the state. And the blue line is what we would, and so I'm not saying that any board would raise taxes this high, but you had the ability to bring this 25, get closer to this $2,500. And the gap between those two lines is that value that we essentially cannot tap into because of the restrictions of Act 388. So that's what questions you have on state funding.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. We'll go around and start again with Ms. Herderick, if that's all right.
No questions right now, thank you.
Ms. Green,
No questions, thank you.
Dr. French.
Thanks. I just want to clarify. So we are the index of tax paying ability basis that is based on total property, including owner occupied homes and rental properties and also business properties. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so we're using that as the index of tax paying ability, even though we can't tax a big chunk of that. Correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Thanks.
Dr. Frazier. Ms. Darby.
No questions. Thank you.
Reverend Mack.
No questions. I just going to make a point that if we try to group these slides and then pause for questions so that we can make sure we get through all of them and be able to ask questions that way. All right.
I don't have any questions.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so I didn't understand.
So as we just sort of, for the sake of time, so that we can stay on a timetable still, if you can just group the slides and then we'll pause and ask questions and then so we can get through all of your slide presentation. I don't want to not to cover all of them. All right.
Okay, and that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to group them by subject area and ask a question.
Okay.
All right, so I think we're great on time though, but we'll do. Okay, so this is just an overview of the general fund expenditures. We'll get into more details on this next month, but just to show where the money goes. If you look at salaries and benefits, almost 70% of the district's general operating fund is for personnel. Purchase services makes up 15%. And you take a look on the right there, you can see what's the types of things in purchase services. The transportation contract, the student transportation, energy costs, custodial, grounds maintenance, instructional programs, et cetera. Payments to charter schools, 11%. And so the charter school funding formula is based on a combination of the amount of revenue that the district receives, as well as the enrollment counts and the demographics of the charter school students. Next slide. And then just to talk a little bit about the changes each year from year to year in terms of cost as it relates to, on this slide, salaries. So we call this investments in teacher and staff retention. So the cost of a step increase and a 2% cost of living allowance for teachers. You can see those two numbers, $4.5, $4.8 million, a total of $9.4 million for teachers projected for next year. Same thing you can see for non-teachers, that number is $4 million for a total of 13.6. So this year we gave all staff, the step increases, all staff that are eligible, as well as COLA. So we were to replicate that next year. This is what the cost would be, $13.6 million. And this is before any potential adjustments associated with the salary studies that we've been talking about. And then the next part of this slide then shows the increases in benefits, and these are increases that we don't have any control over. The state required 1% increase in retirement benefits, $2.8 million. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And then we are projecting an 8% increase in health insurance costs beginning in January. So it'd be half of the fiscal year, $1.3 million. Next slide. So history of retirement. So the OPEB, you may have heard that term batted around. other post-employment benefits. So this is after someone's retired, employees retired from the state, from the school district, and those retirement costs include a base rate of salaries, death benefits, insurance surcharge. So those are the different types of post-employment benefits, and it's a huge liability issue across the country, and not just the school district, not for the state only, but in in the private sector also. There's a big struggle with this. And so I mentioned Gatsby a few minutes ago. The Government Accounting Standards Board, they have pronouncements on how we should handle, different government entities should handle this. But the state of South Carolina, like other states, that liability, retirement liability, was growing. And so that means they have a big fiscal problem as that liability grows. Now, so they did something about it. Now, they didn't stop the growth. They can't stop the growth. It's still growing, the liability. But what they did was that they shifted a portion of the liability out to school districts and to other entities, governmental entities across the state. And so what this table then shows, it demonstrates that shift. So in 2015, the last column there shows that CCSD and other governmental entities, we were paying 15.9% of those retirement costs, 15.9%. So that was a mandatory amount. We had to take that 15.9% and apply it to our salary base, and we had to add that into our cost. In 2015, the state decided to shift some of that liability away from the state over to other governmental entities, in this case, us, the school district. And they put out a table, and there was one exception because of the pandemic year, we didn't have the increase. But there was this increase every year from beginning in 2016 and capping at 2023, fiscal year 23, which we have 2 more years to go, 22 and 23, at 23.81%. And so our contribution has increased from 15, will have increased from 15.9% per year to 23.8%. That's the shift that the state has done on this liability. And the dollar impact to us is, that dollar impact is represented, can be seen at the bottom there, where it says at 22.8% for fiscal year 22, it's like $65.8 million that's going to cost us. Had the state remained at the 15.9% as opposed to shifting, our cost would have been $45.9 million. So essentially, we are paying $20 million more. Will be next year, because of this shift, and then it will go up one more time in 2023, and that increase in 2023 will be in the neighborhood of $3 million or so. So when it's all said and done, we'll be paying somewhere between $23 and $25 million more in these costs because of this shift. Next slide. This slide here is, these again, what we deem to be increases in costs that we don't have any control over, very little control. So it shows the difference, the numbers in 2021 and what we're projecting in 22. The charter schools, so we have charter schools, we have Meeting Street, we have students, there's a state required funding formula, and so we have to follow that formula. And so you can see those numbers are not the total cost. We see the increases from the prior year. So for next year, we're predicting a $4.3 million increase in charter school. The new Center for Advanced Studies up at this year up in North Charleston and Cooper River. So we have new staff, we have no salaries associated with that. And then next year we have the new CAS that's coming online in West Ashley. Translation services to make sure that we'll be able to translate what it is that needs to be translated, documents, et cetera, for our non-English speaking parents. Property and flood insurance, those are costs that we don't have control over. Custodial fire prevention and other contracts, so we have contracts for these, and those contracts have cost escalation clauses. Energy and water, last year we had a decrease, but that's an anomaly. And then the new student transportation bus contract. So those are examples of costs that we bring forward that we don't have any control over. That's in addition to the 13 point something $million if the board were to do the step increases in the cost of living. So you're talking about $27, $28 million just as not a lot of control. Next slide, please. All right, so the last section here talks briefly about the enrollment projections. So what this shows then is the FY20, FY21, and FY22 numbers for students. This excludes charter schools. So the charter school students are not here. So in the winter, when we're preparing to develop the budget, as I indicated, the planning and real estate department does this enrollment projection. And then in the fall, as the school starts, at some point, even 9th day, 12th day, 7th day, it varies, but somewhere within a week or two after school starts, we take an actual head count. So we project in the winter, build the budget, allocate the schools, and then when school opens in the fall, we do an actual head count and we make adjustments. And what this shows then is the difference between the FY20 and FY21, the projected number and the fall number. So 44,570 versus we went up a little bit, 44,987 in the fall. Last year, we actually went down, and that was being driven, I would say, exclusively by the pandemic. But we expect to recover some of those that's shown in the projected fiscal year 22. Next slide. So I'm going to point out where you can see this document here. So don't try to read it. I have a couple of examples on the next slide. But this is on pages 128 and 129 in this year's budget book, the fiscal year 21 budget book, 128 and 129. And what this shows is the allocations that schools get based on the number of students they have, the demographics of those students. So it shows both the staffing allocation, teachers, non-teaching staff, as well as the non-salaries. This in the middle here says GOF supply allocation, copier, $20 per students, non-salary, $50 per student, et cetera. So that's in the budget book on page 128 and on page 129. And then the next slide breaks that out, gives a couple of examples. It gives an example for elementary school, middle school, and high school. So going to the top here with the elementary school. So if you have an elementary school with a second grade, 159 students, what we call the divisor is 25. So that means for every 25 students, that school gets a second grade teacher. So for every 25 students. And then, if you do simply doing the math, that means that this school will get 7 second grade teachers. And then in addition to the teachers, they will get another $11,900 for non-salaries for that second grade. Same thing with the 5th grade. That says the same school, 88 students enrolled. The divisor is 28 students in the 5th grade. So that calculates out to 4 teachers and the $6,600. In the middle block here, which is middle school. So the middle school, this example for this school is 1,065 students. The divisors at those grades is 23. And so there's 46 teachers and 79, almost $80,000 worth of non-salary dollars. And then the same type of calculation down at the high school. So again, in the winter, the projections are done. We allocate out the schools based on those projections. You can see on the previous 2 slides what schools get in terms of the number of students and types of students. And then in the fall, as indicated, once school starts, we take actual count, and we do a comparison of the projected to the actual. And then sometimes we have to we may need additional teachers in the school because more students are there, or less students are there. We may have to shift the teacher from school X over to school Y because more students over here than projected and less over here. So we do that type of analysis with finance and with HR, and then we work not just work with, we have a series of meetings with the academic side of the house, and we determine school by school what type of reallocations we might make. And typically we will create a reserve in the budget. And this year that reserve is $2 million in case that we have to have hire additional teachers, additional staff because of changes in actual enrollment versus projected enrollment. And then for me to wrap this up, I just end where I started. Again, today was for this financial overview, more of an educational type thing on finances for the district. And then in next month, then we will actually bring what we expect to propose to the board for expenditures for next year, taking into consideration the board priorities and goals that you guys just adopted a few weeks ago. And then we will tweak that based on feedback from you all, based on additional information coming from the state on revenue. And then we'll come to the board in June for the second reading for the third workshop headed into the second reading or adoption of the budget. So that concludes my presentation. What other questions do you have?
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. We can start this way. Dr. Frazier, looked like you had a question.
Yes, ma'am. I have two questions. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. This was a very thorough presentation, and I know I'll have time to go over it later. My question to you is, how do we reassure the taxpayer that we are getting the bang for our bucks? If, say, for the past 5 years, our rate of increase of the general fund has increased, steadily increased. But as we look at student achievement, and that's what I want to tie it to, because that's what the public is asking. We're asking for more money, but are we getting better when it comes to student achievement? How do we correlate those two and justify increasing the budget?
So for instance, last year, this time for the fiscal year 21 budget, that was like, I think $12.4 million that was adopted by the board for mission critical. A significant component of that was the acceleration school. So on the academic side of the house, there's work being done on the acceleration school, and there's analysis being done to determine what type of progress is being made. And so I would say, working through with the academic department and the strategic education committee, that's when those types of board governance processes should take place.
And if I might just add, Dr. Frazier, until the state wasn't able to administer the assessments last spring, every single one of our schools that was in the lower rating categories by the state was moving up out of those categories. So we didn't have any ratings for last year, but our schools were making significant progress. And I think that Dr. Williams and Ms. Simmons have presented that in maybe the first or second new board member orientation workshop. I know we've thrown a lot at you, but some of that data is in, I could find the date for you so you could review it.
I want to go back before, say for the past 4 years. How do we assure the public that the budget is steadily increasing, but when we look at, say, test scores, student achievement, however we want to look at it, how do we justify when we ask for a increase this year? And how do we correlate that and say, for the past 4 years, we have done this and this has happened? How do we do that? Is that done through your department, how do we correlate those two to assure the public that they're getting the most for the tax dollars that we're asking them for? Because that's going to come up once we tell taxpayers that we're going to increase your taxes this year.
I don't know if we are going to recommend a tax increase this year. Mr. Kennedy indicated what the finance team is recommending, but he also indicated it hasn't come through budget or the rest of the district administration yet. But clearly, if we're going to give teachers a step increase or a cost of living increase, there will be increases. And I think that when you look at the student achievement results overall, the school ratings don't go up unless the student achievement is increased. That's what that's based on. So I think there is a good way to show that in most instances, improvements are being made, not in all instances. And those, if there were specific programs we invested in that didn't turn out to produce the results we wanted, we need to flag those. And that's usually occurring during the superintendent's evaluation and then at various times throughout the year when the student achievement results are presented. Okay, so the largest increases are around employee insurance, their retirement, the cost of living, and the step increases. And the contracts, yes. Kennedy, thank you.
Dr. Frazier, does that answer all your questions?
I won't satisfy your answer for today, but we can flag what you're looking for to try to go back and pick up some of that information for you.
Okay, yeah. And I understand teacher allocations and how we give each school the amount of teachers that they're going to need. And how do we adjust for those schools that are not doing well? And we're still using the teacher allocation method to staff those schools. How do we account for that? And where's that money coming from?
So what I presented in terms of the teacher allocation is a, I guess I'll call it a simplified version, just trying to show the structure and how we allocate. But I mean, there are other funding sources like the Title I. There's the CSI fund, which is the state allocations for schools that are not performing. And then there are specific student demographics. Not this past year, I don't think, maybe 2 years ago, we had an extensive review of the staff allocation process. Not just my staff in finance, but we had a number of principals, a number of central office staff that are not part of the normal process. And so we spent, I don't know, 2 days, 3 days analyzing the allocations and making adjustments where we could within the limitations of the dollars that we had. So there's a lot of analysis that take place to try to understand what the needs are in individual types of schools and adjusting the allocations to support that.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Dr. French? Thank you.
Yes. So I was trying to understand that allocation a little better. So when the state says the base student cost is $2,500, but they only give us a third of that, is that remaining part that we make up in the local budget? Can we shift allocations to schools that need it more, or do we have to send exactly $2,500 per student to each school?
Well, so for instance, what we call the divisors. So you have 25 students in the second grade. They receive one teacher. So we don't. I mean, the board has the flexibility to say we're going to make the divisor 30 or 35, but that's something that teachers and school principals would push back on. And so we have, theoretically we have the ability to do that, but realistically, because of the limitation of our funding sources, it's problematic. And what the restriction is, so this is not proposing budget. I mean, budget increase or tax increase, but the restriction is Act 388. Without Act 388, you have the flexibility to do what you need for the children of the county. With Act 388, you are extremely limited through that restriction that Act puts on.
Okay, so that's real. I guess I'm concerned because when you you say teachers, are allocated that by that formula, that I don't want to change the classroom size, but teachers are not the only staff at every school. And the chart that you showed us is just showing teachers and supplies. What about, mental health counseling and social services and all the admin that goes along with that? And the fact that some schools actually have higher needs for mental health services, for instance.
So, so I agree that the needs are there, and I also know, since I know the numbers, that some of the challenges. So for comparison, I like to do comparison. So we are a district of roughly 50,000 students. We have a budget of 500 something million dollars worth of general operating fund. When I was the CFO at Boston Public Schools, they have roughly the same number of students, roughly 50,000 students. Their budget is $1 billion. It's same number of students, twice the amount of revenue, and that district does exactly what you're saying. They have 36, I think it is, at least one I was there, 36 specific categories for student needs. And they have specific formulas outside of just the regular, you got 25 students and you need X number, you need a teacher. In addition to that, they are specifically, discreetly identifying what the needs are. So for instance, with the English language learners, people that acquire an English language students, they're, I don't know, 5 or 6 different categories. And but they're able to do that because of the revenues that they have compared to us.
Okay, I like that comparison. Thanks very much. And then I did notice that the millage rate that you mentioned that we're going to recommend to the cabinet, that increase does seem to align really well with the step increase, the COLA increase that we're going to experience. So since we voted for that, I think that it would be good to take that into consideration.
Ms. Green? Ms. Green?
She must be fine. No.
Okay, she said no. Ms. Hardwick?
No, no questions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy.
Ms. Darby?
I wanted to say thank you for the really good in-depth presentation, and I like to hear this every year. It's helpful to me, and if I will just say to new board members, keeping this packet handy, it will be nice because we'll refer to it. And also, I'd like to say thank you to the staff who got us out of the hole that we were in 2015, 16, and to see where we are. And I know Todd Garrett had a lot to do with that, working with you guys, but you all did a great job with that. So thank you. I don't have a question, but just one thing I'd like to say is I still struggle with the paradox of Act 388. And I think that's something that for the board members who aren't here today or for the future, that's something you're going to continue to have to remind us about, why we, it doesn't make sense. Dr. French and I talked about this last week. It doesn't make sense that they are limiting us based on our tax paying ability when we can't tax on that tax paying ability. So that's a struggle for me. And someday I'd love to see that change. But so just be patient with us and reminding us of that. And I also liked telling us the difference when you were in Boston. I think that really kind of puts things in perspective. One last thing is I had a conversation with somebody the other day who was astounded by the fact that we were one of the few districts in the state that was back face-to-face. And I do think you all and the teachers in the classrooms, just went above and beyond this year. So whatever we can do with COVID money to make sure we're, recognizing them or just putting the things in the classrooms to be able to get kids up to where they need to be. But thank you to all of you for the amazing work you're doing.
Thank you. Reverend Mack?
So no question. Just want to say thank you again. I go what Ms. Darby just said, and I do ask each board member to, if there's any follow-up questions from today's presentation between the next workshop, which will be of the first reading of the budget. If you will send those questions to the superintendent's office, and that way everyone will know the questions that are being asked of the review from today. And that way we can have it in the board brief and everyone will be getting the answers as well. So any follow-up questions from today, just submit those to the superintendent's office prior to the next first reading. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess I don't have a question because I kind of know the answer to the thing that I want to know, but I do, I feel at a loss a little bit because of the way that we have to spread the funding around. I think about how the state has in its formula that districts don't get adequately compensated when they can make up property values. But, we know we have schools that have communities that can raise money, booster clubs and things like that. They go on top of that money. And so I do think it's really, and I know that's not something we can get around because that's not formalized money. It's not consistent money we can count on. But I do think it's unfortunate that our schools that don't have that get that sort of base. And then, the others get the base and then pile on top. And so I'm not saying that for any other reason than pontification, I guess, but I do think it's unfortunate. And thank you so much for this presentation. It's super thorough. And the Boston example was helpful.
Great. Anything else? No, I think, yeah. Anybody else have any info? So on Eric's point, what is the best? I am sure people are going to have questions. Can we just email Don? How do we want to handle that? And I do think if somebody's asking a question, we can give the answer to all of us because we probably are all have that. So what process do we want to use between now and the first reading?
So my recommendation is that it goes to the superintendent's office and those questions will be addressed by Mr. Kennedy and those will be included in the board brief.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right.
Yeah. So
One-
maybe I just. So I'm sorry. So my preference, and you may have said this, I apologize, I wasn't listening. Is that the request, the questions come through the superintendent's office so that they can consolidate and send out to me.
Yep. we just said that.
That's exactly what I said.
Y'all are ESPN.
And Dr. French had one last question.
I wanted to second Ms. Waters' request about the impact on the people who are paying the taxes of the millage, like, business owners, boat owners, whatever. Just because I think it will help. I'm sure I don't know how to properly calculate it myself and figure it out. So thanks.
So we'll do that. So it'll be a dollar amount that shows the average for, okay.
And if there's nothing
2:30.
else, are we taking a small break at the adjournment of
Yes.
this? So we can adjourn. It's 2:13, and are we coming back at 2:30?
2:30.
2:30?